gave birth to the idea of a fandom. Now, fandoms for different types of communities have existed before then. We go to the literary side, you had fans for Sherlock Holmes, you had fans for Jane Austen's, you also had fans for baseball, fans for trains. But when we think of modern pop culture fandoms, like us furries, bronies, Trekkies, Star Wars fans, really originated with this group. And this was a period before the concept of a fandom, or what fans should be, was even consolidated. But what these early fans would do is they would start communicating with each other in the back of these fanzines, and then they would start writing with each other and form cross-country, across the world correspondence clubs. Now, while they were united for the love of science fiction, a lot of these correspondence clubs is what we would call science hobby clubs. So they would communicate with each other through snail mail and talk about their love of science fiction. However, while these might be considered the first fan clubs, it is contested whether this would be truly considered the first true science fiction club. And it's the club that was formed in New York in 1929 that is really considered the birth of what we now know as organized fandom. So, we have the birth of the scienceers. So one New York fan named Alan Glasher decided to write and communicate with all the other fans from New York from these letters, and decided to form a club that was not just based around science, but specifically based around science fiction. The next important reason why this was considered the first club is because they had physical club meetings. The previous clubs, they communicated through the letters. This was the first time they had a dedicated clubhouse and dedicated physical meeting spots. And what's very important is most of these fans were actually young teenage Jewish boys. However, they attracted one adult member, an individual named Warren Fitzgerald, who was a 30-year-old African American enthusiast of rocketry. And since he was the oldest member, they elected him to be the president of the club. So during this period when science fiction was predominantly dominated by white males, the first president of the first science fiction club was African American. I think that's a piece of history that has long been lost. I think was very, very important. So he lived in an apartment complex in Harlem and opened his house in Harlem for these young fans to meet, and thus basically created the first clubhouse. And because of him, by having the first physical meetings, it allowed these clubs to really, really form. So the scienceers, one of the first things they started to do is publish what would be called a club zine. So back then, mimeographing was very, very important for communications with all these different types of fans. So they decided to put together a club zine that would not just talk about science fiction news, but fandom news, and publish fan stories. This distinguished the Scienceers club zine, which was called The Planet, from the other club zines that these other correspondence clubs were publishing, because of its focus on fan news, fan personalities, and fan fiction. And The Planet would often be considered the first fanzine because of the template it laid down. But what was most important was The Planet would inspire what was truly considered the first fanzine that wasn't a club zine, The Time Traveler. The Time Traveler was the idea of another New York fan who was a member of the Scienceers, a young teenager named Julius Schwartz. Julius Schwartz teamed up with another Scienceer named Mort Weisinger. They brought on Alan Glacier and a big fan personality during this time period, Forrest J. Ackerman, and decided to make this new zine that was completely dedicated to fans and fandom, thus starting the rise of fanzines during this period. So a big boom of a bunch of different types of fanzines emerged from this type of communication. Now, this would attract the attention of Hugo Gernsback, who liked the idea of these young fans organically organizing themselves, and he would sponsor a lecture at the American Museum of Natural History, where he brought one of his science fiction editors, his name was David Lasser, to give a speech about the future and stuff. And what was interesting about this was he actually did not pay the bill, remember being the cheapskate he was, and stuck these young poor kids with the bill for renting out the museum for the lecture, and thus kind of destroyed the fan club at that point, because you had these young teenage boys who had to inherit the bill. The funny thing was, David Laster was the founder of the American Rocket Society. He was able to poach Warren Fitzgerald to join his club. So an African American would join him, and they would eventually form the first new rocket society called, I think, the American Interplanetary Society, and thus losing their adult member meant they also lost their clubhouse. So basically, even though this was a big moment for the science series, having Hugo Gernsback help organize a lecture for them, it also unintentionally destroyed the club. But it did cause Hugo Gernsback to get the idea, what if I just formed my own organized fan club, one that's kind of controlled and managed by me. So kind of a more corporatized idea of organizing fandom, and this is where we get the birth of the Science Fiction League. The Science Fiction League was a global network where different fans across the country could start their own pockets of fandom and fan clubs in different cities, and you would have some important ones developed around the country. Los Angeles was one of the most important ones in the West Coast, and they would eventually become known as the Los Angeles Science Fantasy Society, also known as LOSFUS, and as we'll talk about later, that would end up helping form Star Trek fandom, anime fandom, and furry fandom, and they're still around today. I think they're currently the oldest fan club, and they're hosting Worldcon this year in Anaheim. Chicago and Philadelphia were also two other important branches of the Science Fiction League. But the most important ones started to come out of New York. So once you start looking at a lot of early fandom history, which I don't think you can because a lot of this information is not available online, you'll notice that fans were also involved in inter-fandom politics and drama. And a lot of the drama occurred in New York City, period. Now, in New York City, three individuals will kind of come to power. These three individuals will kind of shape the next era of fandom. So now we've moved from a period called EO fandom, which is before fandom, and now this is the period of what we call first fandom. The term first fandom is because science fiction fandom considers itself the first fandom, progenitor fandom from which all the other fandoms emerge from. This is a period this is a name they chose for themselves, and kind of the three rising stars of first fandom was again, all young teenage boys. You have Will Sikora, Don Woolman, and John Michelle. And these individuals initially united with each other, but they had different goals. So I'm going to talk about Sikora first. He's what we call an idealist. He followed the Gernsbackian ideal. So the idea of Gernsback's idea for making these science fiction magazines is he hoped that by making short stories and science fiction stories, it will inspire the next generation of science fiction readers to become the next generation of scientists, inventors, and innovators. So he thought by seeding science into fiction for kids, it will allow them to enter the field of science later. This is the idea called the Gernsbackian ideal. And Will Sikora was more into fandom because of his science interests. He was a chemist, and he apparently also kept a jar of pee in his basement for 10 years to see what would happen with it. But he was a very big idealist. He also would organize a lot of rocket experiments. Some of the first rocket mail experiments were done by Will Sikora. Then you have these two other individuals who were on the more leftist socialist side of the equation. You have the youngest member who was 2 years younger than these individuals named John B. Michaud. John B. Michaud, even though he was younger than the other members, he had very interesting politics. He was a member of the Young Communists and tried to indoctrinate all the fellow fans into joining the Communist Party of America. And he would also develop his own philosophy called Michaudism. So he had this idea that science fiction is supposed to be the vanguard for a communist utopia. However, he was a stutterer. He was not good at speaking, so he had all these brilliant ideas, but he couldn't give good speeches. This is where Don Woolman comes into play. So Don Woolman is what we would consider a troll by today's standards. He would insert himself in fandom drama and politics and basically use it to his advantage. So initially it was for fun. So for example, some of the fun fandom shenanigans they would do around this time was something called the Staple Wars. So one of the fans, Bob Tucker out of Chicago, basically started a fake society for the elimination of staples in binding reading materials. He said we could use other stuff, we could use glue, we could use spit, but we have to ban staples. So Don Woolman represented himself as the rebellious opposition and started to make the society for staples, and they had this war that was fought in the pages of the fanzines, because again, that was the social media of that time period. But Don Woolman, while he was doing this for fun, realized he was getting very good at this. He could use these fanzines, write articles to manipulate people to join his side and smear other people. Now, what happened was Don Woolman published a story called The Man from Ariel in one of Hugo Gernsback magazines. However, Hugo Gernsback did not pay Woolman, so Woolman got upset and had to sue for, I guess, the $7 he was not paid. And I guess he won it back. He did win, but most of it probably went to his lawyers. He decided to publish another story under a pseudonym, submitted to Hugo Gernsback, and again, Hugo Gernsback did not pay him. So this radicalized him to socialism and communism, and John Michel was able to use him as kind of his mouthpiece, because Woolman was the great troll. He was, I guess, that era's equivalent of Hassan Piker. So Michel used him as his mouthpiece to espouse Michelism. But all three of these individuals teamed up with each other to take down Hugo Gernsback, and they succeeded. So they would eventually show up to science fiction club meetings, then run up to the podium, grab the gavel, and try to take it over. Michel and Woolman specifically would smear other members in the pages of the magazines. So he would have this campaign of attacking, bullying, and radicalizing people on his side, and eventually Woolman has gained a group of New York fans that were called the Woolman Stooges, that will later become the group known as the Futurians, who were the more socialist leaning side of fandom. But all three of them eventually got banned by Hugo Gernsback from the Science Fiction League, but they basically won in the end, because 2 years later, Hugo Gernsback went bankrupt again and had to sell his magazine, and eventually the Science Fiction League collapsed. And these individuals will become the leaders of the next period of fandom, known as Second Fandom. And they would kind of inherit what will become the next stage of fandom. So most importantly, the New York fan group would split into two oppositions. But before then, they were kind of united. So those three individuals were part of a New York club called the IAS. The IAS decided one day to travel up to Philadelphia to visit other Philadelphia fans. And so this was happened in 1939, so exactly 90 years ago. They went up to visit these Philadelphia fans, and this was an election year. This is when the Democrat and Republican national conventions were happening. I believe the Republican National Convention was happening in Independence Hall in Philadelphia. And as the Philadelphia fans were showing the New York fans around, Woolman just randomly said, "Why don't we just call what we're doing a convention?" And that's actually where conventions got started. And that's why we use the term convention, because it came from the political party conventions. In fact, you'll start seeing that a lot of the early science fiction cons will model themselves off of these parliamentary political conventions, including with having gavels, meetings, business motions, and all that stuff. So that one day impromptu visit of New York fans to Philadelphia by train would inspire them to actually make this a recurring thing. So while the British fans in Leeds were able to form what they consider the first true convention, so both the British and American fans like to claim they are the first convention, what the New York fans did next was host a convention in New York City known as the Second Eastern Convention, but started to put more of the foundations of what we identify with modern cons. So these are very, very small one-day events. They only had 10 to maybe 50 attendees at most. And by modern standards, they would be called meetups. But these were the roots of what these conventions were. And now that we have the second convention happening in New York City, there was an idea, why don't we host an international 3-day convention to coincide with the World's Fair? The World's Fair was going to happen in New York City in 1939, so the idea that all these science fiction fans will be coming to New York City for the World's Fair anyways, why don't we host a 3-day convention? So Sakura nominated Woman to be the con chair of this 3-day World Con, and it was set in stone. So for the next 3 years, it was planning to organize this 3-day convention in New York. So what happened? Well, eventually the friend group will start to slowly split apart. What happened was Sakura, again, he was a Gernsback idealist. He believed that the purpose of fandom was to push people into the realm of science, get people interested in careers in science, while Michelle and Woman thought fandom should be a political force. They should bring fans to become members of the Young Communist Party and try to push people more towards a socialist idea. And because of this, you could see the rupture between these two early groups. Again, the definition of fandom was not solidified yet, and these two groups were slowly moving apart. Now, what did they do at these early cons? Well, they had what was called the after meetings. So you had the science fiction club meetings, and then you had the after meetings, normally at a soda bar, at a diner, at the local automat, where it was just a bunch of kids staying up all night making different concoctions of ice creams and drinks. One of their most interesting drinks was called a science fiction special, which was a banana split with 3 different flavors of ice creams and syrups, star sprinkles. That was called a science fiction special. You add gin to it, it becomes a science fiction super special and might be considered the first convention drink. Now, the next time they host, the third Eastern convention was held in Philadelphia. So you could see the American early cons were flipping between Philadelphia, New York, Philadelphia, New York, Philadelphia, New York. Now, it was basically in a hotel like this, an old style hotel where the elevators are actually, old and had to be controlled in a specific way. So these fans had fun at these conventions. And at this third Eastern convention in Philadelphia, they basically hijacked the elevator and turned it into a makeshift bar. And they will race these elevators up and down with each other, with the hotel staff having to chase these elevators up and down. They even got Sakura to join in on this, and they would make their science fiction super special with other alcoholic drinks in these elevators until the hotel staff finally caught them. So you had all this fun merriment happening at this convention, and then Woman and his gang had to kind of throw a wrench in all the fun. So Woman ended up going up in the next panel. He went up and gave a speech written by Michelle called Mutation or Death. The Mutation or Death speech was a speech to kind of criticize the Gernsbackian ideal. Basically, it said the Gernsback ideal is dead. We've been a fandom for about a few years now, and so far we have produced no scientists or intellectuals or inventors. In fact, all fandom has produced are fan writers. We are producing people who want to be science fiction writers, not to be scientists. So if this is the direction of fandom, we must be a political voice. So he argued the purpose of fandom should be politics, and that fans need to make declaratory statements at these conventions saying we're for the war, we're against the war, we're boycotting this, we're boycotting that. And he got all his Futurians on his side to agree to this notion, but most of the people voted him down. And in fact, after his speech was done, one person's like, I'm just here for this convention for fun. I don't care about any of this politics. And they bolted down his notion. He got so upset that he left the con, and his group splintered off and formed a new group called the Futurians. The Futurians will become very notable in science fiction writing later. But the Futurians wanted fandom to be political. Sakura, ironically enough, wanted while he was not involved with fandom, because Woman at this time was going to all these small science fiction clubs, he was pushing his Futurians to take over the club and then vote to democratically destroy it so that his club will be the only one that remains. So in the ruins of the Science Fiction League, a new group emerged called the Queen's Science Fiction League. It was run by an individual named James Tessari. and he was one of the individuals who believed fandom should be fun escapism. What happened was Woman's group infiltrated the Queen's Science Fiction League and tricked to expel Sakura from the group, and then also expel Tasari, who the club was held in his basement, so he kicked them out, and basically destroyed the Queen's Science Fiction League. Now, because of that, they also had the membership to all the Queen's Science Fiction League members, and any new prospective members they would have join their club. So, for example, a young 18-year-old Isaac Asimov was interested in joining the Queen's Science Fiction League, and he was confused when the first meeting he was invited to attend was in the halls of the Communist Party of the United States, and realized that the Queen's Science Fiction League is now the Futurians group. And he joined the Futurians because that was the only group that was there, and that was kind of Woman's MO. He would take over these different clubs, destroy it, so that his club was the only one that remains. He also alienated another fan from Newark named Sam Moskowitz, and between Sakura, Moskowitz, and Tasari, they decided we need to be the ones who take back control of Worldcon, and they created a new group called New Fandom. And these two groups were now in a fight to try to host Worldcon, and they would attack and criticize each other in the pages of the fanzines. Of course, the New Fandom folks will call the Futurians communists, and the Futurians will call New Fandoms Nazis and fascists and dictators. So it was all this mudslinging. Basically, we see it on Twitter now and Reddit, but basically in the form of fanzines. So the fight between these two New York groups to host Worldcon really started to hash it out. And because Woman was made conchair by Sakura, now that they're fighting, Woman was still technically conchair and he had a group. Sakura had no longer had a group to host the con. So back then, the con is hosted by a con committee or a con-com, which is normally the local science fiction club. Because Woman destroyed all opposition, there's no other opposing group to host it. But eventually, between New Fandom, they were able to finally unite and kind of wrestle control away from the Futurians to host Worldcon. And this is where we're going to introduce the next individual, David A. Kyle. He was also there at that very first Science Fiction League meeting. So he actually was based out of Monticello, New York. Now, because you need at least 5 members to start a branch of the Science Fiction League, he just went to his school and just got 4 random kids to sign up, and he basically started a branch of the Science Fiction League, which was basically him. He ended up joining with the Futurians. In fact, during that first convention in Philadelphia, you could see he's putting the devil horns behind Sakura, so maybe foreshadowing. If this was a documentary series or a movie, it's kind of foreshadowing. Now, David A. Kyle is interesting because he's sometimes considered the grandfather of comics fandom, because he is the first person to draw a comics zine. So the first person to actually do a fanzine in the comics form. Which is ironic because the creators of Superman, Siegel and Schuster, actually weren't doing comics at this time, but they were publishing their own illustrated fanzines, including the first appearance of Superman. Now, David A. Kyle, he was going off to art school, and when he came back, he realized his Futurian friends lost control of Worldcon, and it was in the hands of New Fandom, which he called fascist dictators. So because David A. Kyle's father owned a printing press, before Worldcon happened, he decided to print a bunch of these yellow pamphlets with a warning, with a declaration inside saying that New Fandom is a dictatorship and they're not going to let people speak. And so he printed up a bunch of these pamphlets and hid them in an AC unit outside the convention hall, hoping to distribute them to the con when the con happened. So the first Worldcon, day of the first Worldcon, the first 3-day convention, starting to set the standard for all the conventions that we have to go. So before we get to that, let's finish off this fight between these groups. So what happened was, before they even had a chance to distribute them, staff from Worldcon found these pamphlets, and this was right around when Woman, Michelle, and the Futurians appeared, and basically blamed them for printing these pamphlets and wanting to cause trouble. However, Woman didn't even know about these pamphlets, but he was ironically blamed for them, and he and his other friends were banned from the con, and they were known as the Exiled Six, the 6 exiled from the conventions, and they would try to make their way into the con because the con was on was in Caravan Hall. It was on the fourth floor Caravan Hall. They would constantly try to rush the elevators to get up, only to be blocked by con staff and pushed back down. Eventually, the con staff had to call the police on them, and what they did, Woolman and his group had to go across the street and gripe. They were across the street at the Automat for the next 3 days and basically staring across the street at the con, and they had basically their own rival anti-con across the street since they were banned, which was kind of funny. Leslie Perry, who was another Futurian, one of the few female Futurians at the time, thought this was a grave injustice and actually thought this just proved that New Fandom were dictators since they banned members from the con. She quickly printed her own fanzine, and I calculated this must have happened within 12 hours, but she printed her own fanzine and was to distribute them the second day of the con, which was kind of insane. So you had this fight between these two groups. So as all the chaos started to subside, we have the first World Con, and we have a law first. So let's talk about the con book first. That's very, very important. So I actually was able to finally purchase a copy of the con book on eBay for about $500. And for the longest time, I was wondering, well, this is the first con book, so it's very, very pricey. But for the longest time, I was wondering why all the scans of it were very, very crappy. And it's because it's all covered in gold leaf. And this is because Sam Moskowitz, who was the con chair, was convinced by Julius Schwartz to use his friend to print these. And of course, Julius Schwartz went for the most expensive option to kind of help his friend, saying, no, don't worry, we'll cover the cost of printing by selling enough ad space in it. But what was important is you have organized programming over the course of 3 days. So again, I like to call Worldcon the first convention because it is the con that every single con can trace its roots back to. This con, AnthroCon, Comic Con, Anime Expo, all these cons can trace its roots back to the foundation of what was set by that first 3-day Worldcon. So there was a lot of different firsts. Organized speeches. They had a guest of honor. Franco Paul was the guest of honor for the con. They had an art auction and they had a banquet. So a lot of those formulas you'll see with cons were already started with this first World Con. They also had the first Dead Dog Party. So Mort Weisinger, a few days after the con, had a bunch of extra alcohol. So he invited all the con staff and attendees to just come to his house to finish up all the extra alcohol. And back then, this was the Great Depression era. The prohibition term for an empty liquor bottle was called a dead dog, and thus they called their party a dead dog party, and that term has been kept. So the last party of a convention is often called a dead dog party, the last panel at a convention is often called a dead dog panel, and the last dance at a con is often called a dead dog dance. And that came from 90 years ago from this first dead dog party. Also, one of the zines that I found about the first Worldcon drew this long line to get into the convention, which is something that still hasn't changed over the years. Surprisingly, the con actually made a net profit of about $40, so it was actually in the black, so it was not in the red, which is what you see with a lot of the cons.
How is that adjusted for inflation?
Imagine, about $7,000. So they spent $6,000 for the con and made a profit of they made about $7,000, so about $1,000 profit for the convention, which is actually surprising because they didn't sell con badges, surprisingly enough. You could attend for free. Now, what's interesting is the guest list of this con. Who were the attendees of the con? So you had a lot of the giants who would become influential for the golden age of science fiction, including John W. Campbell, who was a racist. A lot of these people were also racist back then too. But what was interesting is a lot of the people who would become important for DC Comics were there. So I was mentioning Julius Schwartz and Mort Weisinger. You might have recognized their names because they became very influential editors for DC Comics. Mort Weisinger would also become a well-known editor for Superman. In fact, one of the co-creators of Superman, Jerry Siegel, attended that first Worldcon as well. Otto Binder, who was another individual who traveled all the way from Chicago, will eventually also join DC later and become one of the co-creators of Supergirl. So what's interesting with this is you start seeing that, especially with DC Comics, these are all just fans who are just writing other fans into the comics. So funny enough, Schuster, who was the artist behind the original Superman and co-creator of Superman, actually modeled Clark Kent after another Chicago fan. His name was Dennis. And what was also interesting is there was an idea. So the guy who started the Staple War, Bob Tucker, he created the concept of Tuckerization, where you write your friends' names into your stories and works. So, for example, fan personality Forrest J. Ackerman was actually written as a reporter into the first Superman fanzine. Julius Schwartz would name the Atom after his friend Ray Palmer, who was another influential fanzine editor during this time period, who became another influential fanzine editor in science fiction later on. But then you also had the young fans. So you had a 19-year-old Isaac Asimov, who actually, when he learned that the Futurians were banned from the con, really wanted to go to the con, so felt guilty going in, but he needed to go eat lunch, and he was trying to avoid his the banned Futurians at the automat, thinking like he betrayed them. But they're like, no, come join us, tell us what was happening. And then Isaac Asimov kind of became their spy on the inside. So he would go to the con and go back and forth across the street and report what was happening on the con there. Ray Bradbury, another 19-year-old individual, took a Greyhound bus from Los Angeles all the way to New York over the course of 4 days, reading Grapes of Wrath. Some said that reading helped inspire a lot of his stories. He came with all his short stories, hoping to pitch all his stories to these science fiction editors. No one picked up any of his stories, surprisingly enough. However, he had a gay from Seattle named Hans Bach, who was drawing these homoerotic buff male monsters, and actually also submitted his friend's art to these science fiction editors, who actually picked him up. And that is actually why a lot of fantasy stories have buff males on the cover, because it's partly inspired by this, gay author who's drawing his own, artist who's drawing these homoerotic buff males. So he actually did help. While he didn't get picked up by an editor, he helped his artist friend get picked up. The other interesting individual is the youngest member of these convention is Ken Kruger. Ken Kruger was 13 years old, and he'll become important later on when we go to Comic-Con, because he'll be one of the co-founders of San Diego Comic-Con. So a lot of the roots for these different conventions there. Now, another thing that most cons kind of get rid of is the banquet. The banquet was kind of the most important event of the science fiction convention. This is where the guests of honor would give their speech, and it was also very expensive because you had to pay an incredible 25 cents, which is very, very expensive for a lot of these early fans, to get into the banquet to listen to the guest of honor speech. So a lot of fans couldn't afford to go. Most cons have kind of gotten rid of the banquet, but I would say, especially at furry cons, the sponsor dinner is probably the equivalent of what we have with the banquet now. It's mostly known for rubbery chicken and bouncing potatoes, which will become a big meme in science fiction fandom later on. So we could start seeing the foundations: 3-day convention, hotel model, dead dog party, guest of honor, art auction, first cosplay. We'll talk about cosplay in a little bit in the bid. But yes, the foundations of what we could see, every single con can trace its roots to this foundation that Worldcon started. Now, what happened was the Futurians also had their rival con, and after the last day of the con, actually the last day of the con ended with a softball game, which is interesting. It was a tradition that continued for the first few World Cons. It was originally supposed to be against fans and pros, but they couldn't get enough pros to join, so So the softball game happened between the New York fans and the Philadelphia fans. What was an interesting coincidence was this softball game was played on the same day another game was happening at Yankee Stadium just a few blocks down, where Lou Gehrig announced his retirement. So interesting, two baseball incidents happened that same day. So that was also the day the Futurians decided to host a rival convention and kind of discuss, okay, this is the aftermath, this was the equivalent of the feedback. What did you think of the rivals conventions? And, the Futurians kind of admitted, maybe we were a little bit too crazy trying to make everything political, and maybe a con just for fun was probably the right path. So what's interesting is the irony is the idea of what a fandom or what a convention should be was not solidified into this moment. New fandom wanted cons and fandom to be fun escapism for fans to meet up. The Futurians wanted fandom to be political. In the end, new fandom's model won out. However, because they banned the Futurians, they were basically ostracized from the community and lost all relevance as an organization. On the other hand, the Futurians models lost out, but they became one of the most influential groups of science fiction writers and editors into the 40s and 50s of science fiction. So it's kind of ironic. One group lost, but they became relevant. The group that won basically disappeared as an organization. However, this was supposed to be a one-time event, and a lot of them were saying, why are we having just one convention? Why can't we do this every year? So the idea to have a new Worldcon every year started, and fans from Chicago were nominated to be the host of that next Worldcon, which will be in Chicago. And this is when they started to get the idea, oh, these Worldcons seem to have fun names, so they retroactively called New York's con NyCon and Chicago's con ShyCon. So they started to choose names for these different Worldcons. Now, the other irony of ironies is, from these original folks who were part of that big fights and war for Worldcon, Woolman would later become an influential editor of science fiction and fantasy. However, he would famously not pay his authors. So the thing that radicalized him to communism, not being paid by Hugo Gernsback, he will do to other people. And ironically enough, he also published The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit in the United States without permission of the Tolkien estate. So that was his. So the first time The Lord of the Rings was published in the United States was in paperback form by Woolman. Sakura, who didn't really care about fandom and cared more about science, wanted to continuously be the leader of fandom, and apparently Woolman said, like, in the 50s, Sakura called him up saying, we old guard can take back control of fandom and be the leaders of fandom, and Woolman's like, I'm an adult, I don't care about this stuff anymore. So it's kind of ironic that Sakura, who didn't care about fandom when he was a kid, now wanted to be the leader of fandom as an adult. And the other irony of irony is David Kyle, who printed the yellow pamphlet that calls his friends to be banned from that first Worldcon, the first Worldcon Exclusion Act. He would eventually become con chair when Worldcon came back into New York in the 1950s. And because I think the guest of honor at that con was very expensive, the banquet prices were very expensive, so people couldn't afford to go to the banquet. So a lot of them would go to the balcony of the hotel to try to listen to the guest of honor speech, and he would send con security up to clear them out. And that started a meme in the fandom saying, that was basically saying, David Kyle says you can't sit here, David Kyle says you can't sit here. And it is sometimes called the second exclusion act, so he was responsible for both exclusion acts at a Worldcon in New York City. Now, this is where we have to get to the most important fan personality of this time period, Forrest J. Ackerman. Does that name sound familiar? Some of you might recognize the name. What's important about Forrest J. Ackerman is he is basically what this fandom period equivalent to a Poppyfur was. He would write to every single magazine, every single fanzine, and thus his name would be popular out there, to the point when the Science Fiction League was formed, he was given the first honorary membership card because of how influential he was. So he was a big fan personality. He liked to coin a lot of terms, so he would shorten a lot of words and make his own terms for them. So for example, he created the term pen name, and he was the one who coined the term sci-fi. So he had this interesting personality. He was very, very big into Esperanto. And then he was the one who had the idea to dress up at that first Worldcon, and he wanted to dress up as a character from the H.G. Wells movies, The Things to Come. As a big fan personality, he had a lot of fangirls who wanted to help him out, including his girlfriend at the time, an individual named Meryl Douglas, who went by the fan name Moroyo, who was actually, I think, 12 years his senior. So he was in his early 20s and she was in his 30s, and she made him this costume that he wore at that first Worldcon. So he actually was the one who helped loan the money to Ray Bradbury to take the Greyhound to New York City. He took the train to New York City, and apparently when he got off the train, he was greeted by the Futurians, including Don Woolman, and another Futurian who would become a science fiction writer in the future named Cyril Kornbluth. Cyril Kornbluth was a little 15-year-old kid who had a cigarette in his mouth all the time. He apparently walked up to Ackerman and said, "Are you that Ackerman who's writing all those nonsense letters in the fanzines?" And Ackerman's like, "Yes, I am." He punched him in the stomach, and that was it. So that was his welcome to New York City fandom. So Ackerman would wear his costume, and this was before the idea of a costume lounge or a headless lounge existed. So once he put on his costume, he had to wear it all day, including when they were going to the World's Fair. So he wore his costume at the World's Fair, which of course got a lot of heads to turn. At the World's Fair, there was a pavilion where people from different countries could go on stage and speak in their native language. Ironically, Ackerman was, even though he was a big fan personality in the letters, he was very, very, very shy in real life and could not really speak. In fact, when he was asked to give a speech at Worldcon, he had a migraine just trying to walk up on stage until I believe it was the wife of John W. Campbell gave him an aspirin so he could just go on stage and talk. But however, when he was in costume, he felt a little bit more confident and basically went up to that pavilion and spoke in Esperanto, basically saying we are from the future and all that stuff. But he was that big fan personality, and he dressed in his outfit. Now, for a person who would coin a lot of shortened words, you will assume, oh wait, is he the guy who coined the term cosplay? No, what he called his costume was futuristic costume. So it was a very, very long wordy term. In fact, the term cosplay wouldn't be coined until the 1980s. But while people recognize Ackerman as the father of cosplay, the first cosplayers, people fail to recognize, oh yeah, Moroyo, his girlfriend at the time, was the one who made his outfit, and also she cosplayed at that con too. So rightfully, they have now been recognized as the mother and father of cosplay, but they would have a big hand in Los Angeles fandom. And at that second Worldcon in Chicago is where the next new innovations come. I believe because it was held in the Hotel Chicagoan, we could confirm that this would be the first true hotel model convention. But what was more interesting was Ackerman inspired so many people to want to cosplay at that second Worldcon. They just had a lot of people who needed a place to change. So Moroyo opened up her suite at that hotel to allow people to change. And people say that her room, her suite, 689 is technically the first con suite. She started a tradition of having a con suite, and thus by that definition we could also say she also technically created the first cosplay lounge, and since the fursuit headless lounge comes from the cosplay lounge, we could also have her to thank for that long tradition. But opening her suite for con attendees was very, very important, and we had a lot of people dress up, including Jerry Siegel, who actually dressed up as Clark Kent that year as his own character. Technically, Superman's his OC, so he's dressing up as his Sona. So after they all got dressed up, actually Ackerman being Ackerman had them march all through downtown Chicago. They apparently went to a newspaper press office, and he basically said, you guys are going to take a picture of us, and I know because you published this picture in tomorrow's paper. Apparently they took the picture of them, but they never published it, so that would be like a great find if someone could find this picture. But they did have a costume contest, which is very, very important. So this was called a costume masquerade. That's why the term masquerade exists at a lot of these early conventions. The winner of that masquerade was actually David A. Kyle, the troublemaker from that first Worldcon. So actually it was Woolman's girlfriend who made Woolman the Ming the Merciless costume to wear at the convention. And even at that time, I guess Woolman thought it wouldn't be PC of him to wear the Ming the Merciless costume. So David A. Kyle says, I'm going to wear it. And he won the costume contest as Ming the Merciless. But this basically inspired the next era of what we call costume masquerades, the next important step in the convention evolution. And already that first period took a long time to tell, so I'm going to quickly move through the next period. So stage masquerades become very, very important. And we'll start seeing more female costumers come into the foray, especially in the 50s and the 60s. So one of the first great female cosplayers is Olga Lei. She's known for her deep space outfit. She's sometimes called the most beautiful costume during this period. And the other interesting individual is Karen Anderson, who married the science fiction writer Paul Anderson. Karen Anderson would like to dress up in a lot of more fantasy garb, and probably is responsible for inspiring a lot of the fantasy aesthetics that we see at Renaissance fairs and costumes during this time period. Karen Anderson also is notable for spotting the typo in one of the fan publications for science fiction folk music. So science fiction folk music started actually with a lot of science fiction fans at these early cons, because these early cons were held at hotels just like this. There will often be a piano in the lobby, and someone will just go up to the piano and play music, and a lot of them would sing folk songs. When the Futurians came into play, they would start singing union protest songs. So this is where the birth of con music started. This was called science fiction folk. In the 50s, Karen Anderson noticed a typo that spelled it filk, and that became the term for fan music. So filk music is where she got the term, and she's also notable for one of those conventions at the banquets, bouncing one of her potatoes off the plate, and she's like, I could bounce a potato like a ball, and that gave rise to the filk song Bouncing Potatoes to the tune of Waltzing Matilda. Another interesting thing is she would start cosplaying with her daughter, Astrid, they would do dual cosplays with each other. One of the most innovative cosplays during this period was when Karen and her daughter did the Bat and the Bitten cosplay, where Karen dressed up as a vampire and her daughter as the bite victim, and they would use gelatin to simulate blood. Nowadays, that would seem common for costuming, but this was a big innovation for cosplay during this time period. So, like I said, Karen Anderson would help inspire the next generation of, she gave rise to the term filk, and filk becomes a really, really big part of the convention scene. Now, what's interesting is when we go to that family tree I was talking about on the back of my thing, the Comic-Cons actually branched off before convention music started to solidify these conventions, which is why you don't have a music culture at Comic-Cons. But all the cons that came after, anime cons, furry cons, Star Trek cons, all have a music tradition. And this is because of the folk music scene, where they will publish a lot of hymnals that would make these songs. Now, I was wondering what folk music really was for the longest time, because I was saying, couldn't all con music technically be considered folk music? What the bronies are doing, what the furries are doing with the raves, what anime cons doing, the caramel dancing, couldn't this all be considered folk music? And after going to a few science fiction cons, I saw what it was. So, a lot of cons will have panel rooms like this, and they'll sometimes put these chairs in a circle. One person will come in with a guitar, start strumming, and start singing songs. People will join them. So I noticed the folk songs had to be tunes that were recognizable, lyrics that had repeatable choruses that were easy to learn after the second go, and were very, very easy for people to just join in the circle and join in singing. So it had to be really singable, repeatable music. And that's where we get this culture of folk, which is based around Appalachian bluegrass music, like I said, the union protest songs, but most importantly, especially in the 60s, sea shanties. So this would inspire the type of music that these conventions were doing with their folk circles at different cons. And you see this as a big tradition, whether it's an old convention or a new science fiction convention. The folking circle is very, very important part. And because it's all fan-made music, there's really no professionally recorded song. So most of the cassette tapes that were distributed were just someone, just recording what was happening. That included all the laughter and background music and stuff, and that kind of gave it a more, folksy, fanish, amateurish vibe. And a lot of these songs have never been professionally recorded, which makes this a really unique temporal thing. The other important thing science fiction cons will start to introduce were the con badges. And con badges will also include ribbons. Ribbons started to become a very, very big part of science fiction cons, to the point people would want to start collecting ribbons, especially from the bidding parties. To the point where when I went to Worldcon, I didn't want to wear these long trail of ribbons like everyone else was, so I specifically wore the ribbons I needed. My exhibitor ribbon, my room party host ribbon, my panelist ribbon, and already it was a foot long after all the necessary ribbons that I needed. But badges, ribbons became a very, very big staple part of the convention scene during this period, but the most important thing I think I will talk about is the room parties and the party floor. Now, remember when I said that science fiction fandom was a progenitor fandom? It was a catch-all term that included comics fans, anime fans, proto-furries, what we would consider early science fiction, and fantasy fans. So how would you meet up with your fellow like-minded fans? So this is where they would put a community bulletin board in the lobby of the hotel, where people could put post-it notes or write their room number and what fandom they're involved in. So for example, someone might write Doctor Who fans meet in Hyatt 204 at 8 p.m., and this is how you'll meet with your like-minded fans. This is why the party floor was such an integral part of the convention scene. Because nowadays, when you go to an anime con or furry con, you might have meetups for specific anime shows or meetups for specific species. But this was the early way for these early fans to meet up with each other. And from these room parties, some of them would get so big, they would branch off and become new conventions in their own right. I even believe this very room party board that's been circulating for probably 50 years now probably is the same one that gave birth to anime and furry fandom as well. So the room party floors are very important. So aside from leading like-minded fans, the other important element was this is where the bidding cities to host Worldcon would throw their parties. This is where they would have their bid parties. Remember, like the Olympics and the World's Fair, Worldcon changes hand every year and is held in a different city. So it was believed that if the city that throws the best party would probably be the best Worldcon host. And this is where we get all these different cities trying to host the best room parties to get voted. Normally the ballot box to host the next Worldcon would be on the party floor as well. So you go to science fiction cons now, they still have these bidding room parties. And some of them were just like fun, silly parties. So I went to one of the Worldcon parties I went to a few years ago was just called the Purple Party. Everyone was just dressed in purple and all the drinks and food were purple. So it's just all the fun they could have. The other thing is, a lot of these room parties, even still to this day, are kind of, a lot of these different fandoms would use their room parties to kind of be like the ambassadors of their community to the science fiction community. So for example, the Klingons would host their Klingon Black Hole party and kind of represent the Trekkies and Trekkers at these conventions. BabsCon, which was a BronyCon in San Francisco, would often host a room party at Further Confusion, for example, and kind of be a representative bronies. So you start to see other fandoms trying to represent themselves on these party floors. So from these room parties, you'll start getting, like I said, you'll start seeing new types of conventions. One of the first types of conventions to branch off from this period is called a Relaxicon. And the Relaxicon is essentially a con that disregards everything I said was a definition of a con. And it's just they rent out a hotel for 3 days, no guests of honor, no banquet, no dealers, no art show, no panels. It's just everyone just throws a room party for 3 days. Everyone hosts their different room parties. And this is the concept of Relaxicon. In fact, you could argue that the furries are continuing this tradition. Furry Siesta could be said to be the Relaxicon of Furry Fiesta. And my friend Shugnazi, who does a flop in Las Vegas, is essentially doing a furry version of a Relaxicon. However, the big room party to change the convention scene in 1951 at the 9th Worldcon in New Orleans was the Room 770 party. And this was a party that started at one person's hotel. He was silenced and kicked out by hotel staff, went into someone else's room and continued his party there. This party lasted for 2 days and basically gave birth to what we call all-night fandom. So most of the time, when the last panel happened, that's it, the con would end. But this was the first party that really inspired fans to stay up all night until morning, and they go to the local diner with bloodshot eyes and continue the day again with no sleep. So the birth of all-night fandom. So that's why if you talk to old science fiction fans, whenever the term 770 comes up, it normally references fan merriment, fanish merriment, and fan activities specifically related to all-night fandom. The other party that comes from this was actually started by George R.R. Martin. So the Hugo Awards started where if you won a Hugo, you were invited to the Hugo's winner party. George R.R. Martin was losing the Hugo Awards during this time period and thought, hey, why don't we just throw a Hugo losers party? So anyone who lost the Hugo could join his party, and if you were a Hugo winner and wanted to join, you have to basically explain your case of why you are a loser and come to this party. George R. R. Martin basically hosted this party consistently from the 1970s all the way to the 1990s. And then the hosting duties, basically, it was the next year's Worldcon's host that normally would host the parties. Then in 2015, probably to procrastinate more from finishing the Game of Thrones series, he decided to take up hosting duties again at Worldcon, and then he stopped hosting the Worldcon, the Hugo Losers Party in 2021. And I wonder why he stopped hosting it, but maybe it was because that year a blog post called George R. R. Martin Can F Right Off to the Sun was nominated for a Hugo Award. So who knows? All right. So yeah, Party Floor, very, very important part. And this is where we get one of our first branch off, the comics fandom. So comics fandom was kind of a sub-branch of science fiction fandom during this period. So for example, I'm a fan of TF and Transformation. Transformation fandom could be seen as a subsection of the larger furry fandom. So at this point in time, the idea of having separate fandoms was not really a thing yet, and they were arguing in the comic zines, how can we be considered our own fandom in our own right? And Jerry Bales, Dr. Jerry Bales, who was writing the Comics Journal, basically said to be a true fandom, we have to host our own conventions. It's only when we start hosting our own conventions we could be truly considered a separate convention. And a young high school kid named Bernie Bubdis, who was about I think he was 16, 17 around this time, out of New York City, basically offered himself up. I could host a small convention at my house, and eventually he teamed up with other high schoolers, and they eventually decided to host a one-day New York Comic Con together in 1964. So the one-day New York Comic Con was basically a half-a-day event, and basically is truly considered the first comic convention. It was again done by young high school kids in New York City, just like Worldcon, just like we'll see with other cons coming up beforehand. So he wanted to try to convince all the big comic publishers of this time to come to his convention. So he approached Marvel Comics, and Steve Ditko, the co-creator of Spider-Man and creator of Doctor Strange, was able to attend representing Marvel. In fact, this is the only convention that Steve Ditko, who's notoriously a recluse, ever attended. In fact, he drew the comic book cover for New York Comic Con, which was as strong as Spider-Man, but unfortunately it wasn't printed in time for the con, so you had to get it after the convention. He also approached DC Comics to represent themselves at the con, and when he went to the DC offices, guess who was in charge of DC Comics at this time? Hey, it was Julius Schwartz, the guy who printed that first comic book for that first Worldcon, and he was so this young high school kid basically went to Julius Schwartz trying to convince him, hey, I'm starting a new type of con, there are comic cons, please have DC represented. Julius Schwartz took out that first Worldcon comic book out of his desk and says, you want a real con, kid? This was a real con. Bernie basically said something along the lines of, I don't care about your old people conventions, and was instantly kicked out of DC Comics offices. So kind of funny right there. What's also interesting is, who else attended the con? A young 16-year-old George R. R. Martin. That was his very first convention. Also, a young 16-year-old Len Wein, the creator of Swamp Thing and editor of Marvel Comics. So again, you start seeing a lot of the roots of these early people who started these conventions. Now, it's believed a science fiction fan named Shale Dorf, based out of Detroit, attend this convention, and this inspired him to take a convention he recently took control of, the Detroit Triple Fan Fair, and start including comics as a main element of the Detroit Triple Fan Fair. After running the Detroit Triple Fan Fair for a few years, Shale Dorf moved to San Diego in 1969, and when he went to San Diego, he went to a local comic book shop that was owned by Ken Kruger. That 13-year-old kid who attended that first Worldcon, well, now he was an older adult running a comic book store. And between Shale Dorf and Ken Kruger, they decided to start Golden State Comic Con, and they invited Forrest J. Ackerman to be the first guest of honor. Now at this time, Forrest J. Ackerman evolved from being a fan personality to being a notable editor for Famous Monsters of Filmland, basically starting the horror fandom as we know it to this day, the Universal Monsters horror fandom, as well as he was also the co-creator of Vampirilla. Forrest J. Ackerman was a big notable individual, basically asked to be the first guest of honor, and then they approached Ray Bradbury, who was no longer a young kid, but now a famous author, to be their guest of honor. Ray Bradbury said, yeah, I could do it. My speaking fees are about $4,000. And they're like, oh, we don't have that money. And he was like, well, I do speeches for free for nonprofit events. And they're like, yes, we are nonprofit. And that's actually why San Diego Comic-Con is nonprofit, because they told Ray Bradbury they had to make themselves nonprofit. So Golden State Comic-Con became known as San Diego Comic-Con after a few years, and basically set the next standard for the comic for the convention scene, including adding what we now know as the Artist Alley. And we'll see the Artist Alley independently evolve a few times. This type of Artist Alley was specifically meant for professional writers in the comics fandom and artists to have a place to sell their comics, sell original prints, even do on-site commissions and autographs. So very, very different type from the anime Artist Alleys that we'll see later on. So around this time, we will have the birth of the industry. I call it the industry artist alley just to separate from the fan artist alley at the anime cons. But this was around the time of the underground comics movement, specifically out of Austin, Texas, and San Francisco, California. So you'll have individuals like the Air Pirates and Robert Crumb making underground comics during this period. In Japan, you see a very similar evolution for underground comics in the form of Dondinshi. Dondinshi circles started at the science fiction cons at Japanese conventions, and they eventually overwhelmed the science fiction cons in Japan that they were kicked out and decided, hey, let's form our own convention. And they started Comic Market, which we now know as Comic Ket. And they would start the second type of artist alley, the fan artist alley, where fans would draw fan art and fan comics of copyrighted anime and manga characters that is technically illegal, but they were able to get away with it, and 90% of this was all smut. So we'll see this again. Tijuana Bibles, Star Trek zines, Dondinshi, very, very similar, adult in nature, copyrighted characters. So now we see two different types of artist alleys evolve. Both came out of the underground comic zines, fandoms, and ostracized science fiction fans, and we see this big tradition of Tijuana Bibles, fanzines, and doujinshis really emerge during this time period. Comic-Con is now the largest convention in the world. It is 3 times bigger than San Diego Comic-Con and held twice a year, and there is no programming, no concert, no industry. It's basically a giant convention center of one giant artist alley, so it's very, very impressive for what it is. So from the underground comics movements in the science fiction cons, we'll get the next important individual, Steve Galleci, who would start his Albedo Anthropomorphics zine. What was very notable was he was appearing at the art shows at a lot of these early science fiction cons of his anthropomorphic animals. So the idea of funny animals was very important. So they were called funny animals during this time because they were literal funny cartoon animals, and also comics were called the funnies. So funny animals fandom was starting to emerge around this time. Steve Galleci was very important in fact. And in fact, Stan Sakai published his first comic in Albedo as well. So a lot of early, what we will call furry artists got their start during a period before the term furry was even coined. Now, it was the art show where a lot of these things got started, and we have to go back to that Los Angeles Science Fiction Club, because we'll have the next important individual, Bijo Trimble, start an idea called Project Art Show. Bijo had an idea, why don't we have an art show at the Worldcon that's being held in Pittsburgh in 1960? And she started what's called Project Art Show to have boards and grids for artists to display their art. So very, very different from an artist alley. And this was so popular, it was repeated at the next few Worldcons. And eventually when San Diego Comic-Con got started, they asked her to run their art show. So the art show tradition started there. Now, Bijo was also notable for another thing. She started the Save Star Trek campaign, and it was because of her that enough fans were able to make enough attention that Star Trek got its 3rd season. So, the other reason why Star Trek fandom started to slowly emerge is when you think about convention programming during this time period, there was only one panel room, and there was not all the different programming tracks that we have now. But when Star Trek fans started to fill up these science fiction cons, that one panel room we filled the Star Trek panels, a lot of people just went off to the bar because they want to do this. And after 40 years of only having one panel, people thought, oh, we can have more than one panel at the same time. So we get the birth of what we call multi-track programming. So now you have different programming rooms dedicated to different ideas, like a writing track, a cosplay track, so on and so forth. The Star Trek fandom will become big. They will eventually be kicked out of the science fiction cons, and then eventually start their own conventions. But notably, it was mainly female-dominated, a female fan base. The founders and chairs of these science fiction, the Star Trek cons, were predominantly all female, and they basically overwhelmed the convention scene. with Star Trek Lives, the most notable of the Star Trek conventions, All-Star New York City. The first year it had 3,000 attendees, second year 6,000 attendees, third year it had 15,000 attendees. It just started to grow and grow and grow. To the point where you have Worldcon in blue, San Diego Comic-Con in red, and Star Trek in yellow just really jump off. And the next time we'll see something like this is when the bronies come on the scene, but this was very unique for what the Star Trek fandom was doing. However, the Star Trek fandom kind of grew and then started to shrink again. However, because they had to innovate, because the way to run a science fiction convention and Comic-Con around this time was only for a few hundred to a few thousand attendees, mostly in a hotel. You didn't have to expand into a convention center, but now that they had to expand to a convention center, they had to change the entire method of what staffing a con was. And thus they had to create new types of ways to staff a convention, including forming con volunteers known as gophers to help organize and do the back and forth labor, different types of departments, the idea of different programming rooms. The Hucksters Hall was their early equivalent of a dealer's hall during this time period. And most importantly, you had the formation of con volunteer security forces like the Dorsai, Regulars, and Flare formed during this period. Star Trek fandom was kind of ostracized, which is why Star Trek fandom is kind of considered like the geeky. Whenever TV or media needs to make fun of conventions, they'll often make fun of Star Trek fans, because it was the Star Trek fans who were running these cons during this period. After the Star Trek cons kind of faded away, they quickly changed the Star Trek cons to become multimedia conventions. So basically, while science fiction cons for the first 40 years were the default generic pop culture conventions, after the Trekkies came on the scene, they would change their conventions to become the default multimedia conventions, and then science fiction cons became more and more insular into the literary genre as well. So you have the formation of things at these Star Trek cons like the Hucksters Hall, which will eventually form into the dealers halls that we have at a lot of cons now, and then the Celebrity Zoo area, which is a section where a lot of washed up celebrities will do autograph signings and stuff. Very, very big with a lot of the media cons that we see now. Show accurate costuming was very, very important. So this was one of the costumes right here. This is Spock's pet from the animated series, and this is actually absent in furry history, but I could argue this might be technically one of the first fursuits that we have at a convention, and actually she won the costume contest at that Star Trek convention. And it's interesting because the connection between Star Trek and furries, I haven't really delved into this. Ironically, Furry Fiesta's theme this year is Star Trek themed, but there is an interesting connection between furries and Trekkies, I think. And you see this, a lot of the early cosplay before the formation of the furry fandom all came in the form of anthropomorphic outfits that Trekkies and Trekkers use. All right. So let's kind of move quickly forward. The term cosplay was coined by a Japanese magazine writer who went to a Worldcon in the US, and he saw what the Trekkies were doing on stage, the costume masquerades, they were doing skits and costume on stage, and he wanted to kind of translate that term into the Japanese audience. For the Japanese audience, however, masquerade translates into high society ball in Japan, so he decided to create the term costume play, which became cosplay, and that thus became the term for most science fiction cons. I'm going to quickly go through this, but we have a history of a lot of cosplayers. Scott Shaw, one of the other co-founders of San Diego Comic-Con, basically dressed as his turd character, a monster made of turds and stuff. And he basically wore a bathing suit and stocking, covered himself in peanut butter, which melted under the hot lights, went on stage, dripping his outfit everywhere. In fact, the costume rules made a rule that you can't have your outfit drip on the stage. That's still a rule in official costume contests now because of Scott Shaw. He went to the shower and had to wash all the peanut butter up. Apparently the maid came in and she wasn't shocked. She was like, yeah, I seen worse. But what happened was a week later, the con got a call from the hotel saying, yeah, our pipes are clogged and there's peanut butter in there. And apparently they were fined by the hotel for all the peanut butter. If you guys know about the Homestuck Sharpie bath, that's probably like the early equivalent of that. So again, con history is very sickly. Everything's repeating all the time. Yeah, Homestuck Sharpie bath. Alright, so costuming became very, very important. So going back to Lost Fest, so from the Los Angeles Science Fiction Club, we have Moroyo and Ackerman, we have Bijo, Trimble, Sage, Star Trek, but we also have another two important individuals, Fred Patton and Mark Marlino, and who would start their own anime-based club, which is interesting. That was starts. before the term anime was even a thing in the United States, it was called Japanimation. And it was very, very hard to get Japanimation in the United States. So they would organize a group called the Cartoon Fantasy Organization. And the purpose of this group was to kind of help circulate, like record bootleg anime and circulate it around to different clubs around the United States and do anime screenings of this. So their group specifically helped start anime fandom in the United States. Mark Morellino picked a skill tier as the mascot of his club. And different clubs around the country, including the New York fandom, would have their own mascot. Their mascot was the Philanthep, created by Ken Sample. It is also believed Ken Sample is the individual who created the concept of a fursona. So anime fandom basically emerged from this period of the Cartoon Fantasy Organization, and eventually it would attract the attention to Gainax Studios, who would help sponsor an anime con in the United States called Anime Con in Los Angeles, helped by Baycon staff and Cartoon Fantasy Organization members. And it was so big and successful, they quickly moved out of the hotels and started to move into convention centers, and Anime Con became renamed Anime Expo. So we had the birth of anime fandom, and of course the anime cons will import the comic text style of the artist alley to the United States. That's why we have different types of artist alleys here in the United States now. So what's interesting is that Cartoon Fantasy Organization split, because now that anime was starting to become more established in the United States, the purpose of the Cartoon Fantasy Organization was no longer needed. However, there was a lot of fans in the Cartoon Fantasy Organization who wanted to remain behind because they had a love for anthropomorphic animals. And there was no term for this yet, so they decided to continue the Cartoon Fantasy Organization for their love of funny animals. And Mark and his partner Rod decided to throw what were called funny animal room parties at these different science fiction cons, including WesterCon, WorldCon, and San Diego Comic Con. These prancing skill tier parties eventually became known as furry parties, and this is where we get the term furry for the furry fandom as well. So these furry parties started to become very, very big on the party floor, to the point that they would get so big, just like the other room parties that got so big, decided we can form our own convention. And thus Mark and Rod decided to take the Prancing Skill Tier party and form their own convention called Conference, which is the first furry conventions. And what's interesting is, unlike the other cons, when they branch off of science fiction, quickly evolved, because the furry fandom was so small during this period, it was able to remain in the hotel and keep the hotel model convention style. So because of this, the furry cons actually kept a lot of the DNA of the science fiction cons that you see continue to this day as well. So in fact, a lot of small furry cons still have an art show. An art show is absent at a lot of new types of cons now. They would keep other traditions. So for example, they also kept a costume masquerade. And of course, this was back when before fursuits were more breathable, so the only times people will wear fursuits at the cons were for the costume masquerades. The costume masquerades were normally the big highlight event at science fiction cons, held Saturday evenings. However, when Mark and Rod took over and decided to, when they were doing their conference, decided to open up Saturday evenings for room parties and other events and move the costume masquerade to Saturday afternoon. However, because it was now moved to Saturday afternoon, that means the dealers were unable to see the fursuits. So after the costume masquerade was done, they would march all the fursuiters through the dealers' den, starting the tradition of the fursuit parade. And so nowadays, there's no furry con that has a costume masquerade anymore, but they still have a fursuit parade, which you could see is an evolution of that tradition. A lot of the furry cons also kept the con suite, or the hospitality suite, until they outgrew it and eventually moved into convention centers. So I think Anthro, Ohio was the last furry con that still has a con suite. But the evolution of fursuiting became really, really big. So we have Robert Hill, who worked with Disney, so brought the Disney aesthetics of costuming to mascots. So a lot of the early fursuits were more based off sports mascots, and he decided to move the more character style costumes from Disney's, and he would make a lot of fursuits. His most famous is Hilda the Bamboy, which was the female deer fursuiter you see at a lot of furry history and documentary panels. Another interesting thing is the guy who started the furry track at at DuckCon, which was a science fiction con in Chicago, ended up starting after the furries overwhelmed the science fiction cons. They were kicked out again and then started their own convention called Midwest Fur Fest. So Robert King, started Midwest Fur Fest, but he actually started a fanzine called it the Fursuit Mailing List, and that's actually where we get the term fursuit. So he was actually play on the term fursuit, and this is where we get the term fursuit. So we see the evolution of furry fursuits during this time period. Again, it was very, very. You can still see a lot of the roots of how a lot of these fursuiters were made, and then eventually Uncle Kage was invited as guest of honor to one of these early cons. It was Albany Anthrocon. He was invited as guest of honor, left as concher, still is concher to this day as well. He eventually moved Albany Anthrocon to Philadelphia, and then eventually to Pittsburgh, where it simply just became known as Anthrocon. And Anthrocon sometimes like to claim they started the fursuit parade, so there's a lot of different cons that like to say they were the ones who started the fursuit parade. But traditionally in furry history, it was Anthrocon, Albany Anthrocon, and Yappy Slyfox, who was the one who started the fursuit parade. Yappy, I think, was also one of the co-founders of Megaplex, the furry con in Orlando. And by tradition, Yappy still normally leads the Anthrocon fursuit parade because of that. So because of this, the furries had to create their own type of room, and this is where we get the birth of the Headless Lounge. So we can see the Headless Lounge is the evolution of the costume suite that Moroyo started earlier on. And then this is, of course, the period where we start seeing the more corporatization of the big conventions, San Diego Comic-Con, ReedPop, Fan Expo, all the corporatization of conventions, basically moving conventions out of the small hotel model conventions we're used to that the Science Fiction Con started to more corporate in the science fiction, in the convention center fandom. So in Japan, you started seeing cosplay culture really, really emerge. For our references as furries, the most important thing that the Japanese started was the kimono-style fursuits that include big plastic eyes and more padded legs, which get very, very hot to wear. And then bronies were the next interesting evolution to come into play. Brony fandom started on 4chan, a lot of adults who actually were trans women, so we have a lot of trans females during this period who didn't realize it. And it's interesting because in the Brony convention scene, a lot of the founders and chairs of pony conventions are trans. So because of this, they would introduce a lot of different elements. The Brony cons on a whole started to emerge very fast, starting out again in New York City before filling up the country and the world to the point there's more pony cons happening in the United States than there were like Doctor Who, Star Trek, Star Wars, Harry Potter cons combined. The bronies would introduce a lot of their own elements. So for example, because of how they had their own version of a Dash Con called Las Pegasus Unicon, they had to create a new department called the VIPR department, Viper department. Because this was a kids show, they would have kids areas. Cosplay became really, really big thing with the pony cons, but I think the most important thing the pony cons probably are known for are their mascots. Their mascots are very, very popular at pony conventions. You could sell plushies of their mascots. They sometimes have actors dressed in as their mascots as well. So something you don't really see at furry cons, but this big mascot culture happening at pony conventions. And of course, furry fandom had its own separate evolution with cosplays. They even had their own versions of fursuits. Animal Man Go Home. Of course, famous culture became very big, similar to the poppy furs of this time period. Music became a really important thing. So Brony fan music really, really started to take off to the point that Brony started to host impressively big concerts. So even though the pony cons around this time are a few hundred to a few thousand attendees, they had concerts that would basically outdo the equivalent anime and furry concerts during this time period. Because of this, you had to have an equally talented AV team to suit. So the bronies really innovated AV for the convention scene to the point most conventions now, especially furry cons, are poaching bronies to run their AV teams. A lot of, just check the Wi-Fi for the AVs at these different brony cons, furry cons. You see that there are a lot of AV people. Because brony music was so big, you didn't have enough time to fill the concert with all the people. So they created a renegade stage for these different bronies to play their music. So very similar to the folk circles I was talking about earlier, but because like I said, a lot of the brony fandom was trans, they were the first to introduce a lot of elements like the pronoun ribbons, gender neutral bathrooms, and autism communication tags. So these are things that the bronies brought to the forefront, that the furry cons eventually also picked up on, but most importantly, the bronies helped innovate a lot during the pandemic with the VR conventions, which helped inspire the furries to do the virtual reality portals as well, which is still a tradition at furry cons. And I think with that concludes my panel. So thank you all very much. So if you have questions, I'll be in the dealer stand tomorrow. So see me in the dealer stand tomorrow. I'm at table 8 in the second half of the dealer stand. You can pick up a copy of my comic. Again, thank you very much.
Yes. I knew it was missing more information.